Robert Crutchington, Encoded. Save me.
I will. Thank you very much. Okay, so good evening and thank you so much for welcoming me. My name is Rob Crutchington. I'm the CEO of Encoded. We've been going almost 25 years. One of the things I'd like to get across this evening is it's more of an educational presentation. So there's going to be some terminology that hopefully you haven't heard before. So if any of the questions at the end want to expand on that, happy to do so. And there's also a QR at the end. So if you want to get in touch afterwards, then please feel free to do so. Okay. Oh, by the way, if you can't hear me, put my hand up because I can hear me perfectly. So here we go. So just a little bit about Encoded. So we are privately owned. We haven't gone down the VC route. So 25 years ago, I had a full hell of hair, glint in my eye, and no idea where this was going to take us. And here we find ourselves in the wonderful island of Jersey, and we are producing payments or supplying payments to some of the merchants here that you've probably used yourself. So Jersey Telecom, Food.je, and a few others. So you probably use this without even knowing it. We process many billions every single year, but as a gateway, the amount of revenue that goes through us isn't that important. We're really interested in the per click type thing. And again, that'll make a bit more sense as I progress through the presentation. We own all our IP. We've got patents going through Europe and the US. And again, I'll try and cover that a little bit later on. But enough about us. It's not really about us this evening. It's more about what we can do for Jersey and what businesses in Jersey can take advantage of using a gateway orchestrator. Okay, so orchestration is one of the buzz terms I'm going to be talking about. But before I can really talk about orchestration, I want to try and make sure that you understand what it is that's different about an orchestrator rather than a payment gateway. So a lot of you are probably familiar with Stripe. I know that on the TechX WhatsApp group, Stripe gets mentioned quite a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are and maybe why it's not, why they're maybe not so interested in the islands and really how other merchant providers can capitalize on that. So before we can go into that, we understand what a gateway is. So if you were to go to somebody like Barclaycard, WorldPay, Adyen, or pretty much any of the big acquirers, one of the things that you'll find, and Stripe, you'll get a merchant account and you'll get access to their gateway. So a gateway is basically a way that the card information could be sent to a card issuer. A card issuer will then generate an authorization code once it's done various checks. So things like, is there enough money in the bank? Is this within your spending limits and usual spending criteria? Is the merchant category code of the merchant that you're using in any of the fishy areas? So things like crypto and adult and stuff like that are often declined if they're outside of your usual spending habits. So what we've got here is the card holder is then connecting with the merchant. This can be a high street shop, it can be an online retailer, something of that nature. The card information is then sent various, so it can be an agent in a contact center, out of hours automated service, a shopping cart, whatever method you've decided to put your card information in. It's then sent through to the acquiring bank. They are then issuing, collecting that authorization code, and then at settlement, the money is moved from the issuing bank to the merchant bank, and then into the current account of whichever bank you're using. Okay, so very, very basic way of how it's working. When we start thinking about orchestration, I want you to try to imagine that the orchestrator, in other words, us in this, and there are others, is almost like a conductor when it comes to payments. And instead of having that one-to-one relationship where you've got a gateway and an acquirer, an independent orchestrator will have built the relationships with the various acquirers. Okay, so we are not affiliated with an acquiring bank. We have gone through the arduous journey of building out relationships with as many as possible. Okay, so and this is on a global footprint. So and again, we'll start to see orchestration in action later on. But let's say that we then have the card information that has come from the merchant. The first thing we want to do is work out which gateway is going to be relevant for that transaction. All of this is in real time. A gateway is usually where stored card information is held. So if you have used that merchant before and you've chosen to store your card information, we will want to make sure that we use that gateway again so that we can then pick that card information up. Now, there is this thing called network token, which is where the schemes themselves are now starting to offer this functionality. But for the time being, and for the purposes of this, we're going to select the gateway that is relevant to that transaction. We then want to try and make sure that we're using the acquirer that is relevant to this transaction. Now, let's say that we've got a global business and we have got somebody in the island of Jersey that's maybe a German national. So even though that we are thinking about pound sterling, they're issuing bank and everything that they're going to be doing is in euros. So if they make a purchase here, not only are they going to be worrying about FX and exchange, but the merchant gets international interchange exchange as well. Okay, so it's going to be expensive for both parties. As an orchestrator, what we would generally do is say, that's fine. If you think you're going to have US, euros, or wherever, then get a merchant account that is local to any domestic cardholders that you think you're going to be using. And that means that in real time, we can then put that transaction through to the merchant account that is going to give you or attract the best possible rate. Now, there's some underlying things. You must have a company that's registered in the local territory and so on and so forth. But as an example, we work with, or we process for Samsung. And so we try to follow the sun. And they could be having people in any country purchasing in the local currency, but they may settle in a currency that is not where they are making that transaction at that time, okay? So we can then start moving down. We go then to the schemes. So where we might decide to use a different scheme, and normally if you look at your card, you will see the issuing scheme. So you might look at your card and it's say Visa or American Express or MasterCard or whatever. The schemes behind the scenes work collaboratively together. And I've mentioned briefly about network tokens. So one of the things that Encoded does is that we are global preferred partners with Visa. So if you store your card information, we are actually storing it with Visa. So we don't touch it, hold it, or do anything with it. We are then pushing it into the scheme. Now, the reason for that, when that transaction comes down to the issuing bank, they can tell that that token has been generated and stored by Visa. And as a result of that, it's given a little bit of uplift in credibility. So if you are doing, or if you can imagine the volume of transactions that you're processing is very, very high. If you get a percentage, even if it's a small percentage, of declined transaction because the issuer doesn't trust where that token is being stored and generated, by using schemes, you can then lift that up. And we are now seeing a significant lift of authorization codes as a result of this frictionless payment. Okay. Then we come down to the issuers. Now, this is possibly one of the areas that we have the least amount of control because we can't influence. But if you're familiar with things like curve cards, or if you've even got alternative payment methods like Apple and Google, you'll know that multiple cards can be held against multiple issuers. So Curve, as an example, you have a single card, it's usually a debit card, but on the app you will then backload whichever card you want to use at that moment in time. Okay, makes sense? If you're not familiar with that, then by all means have a look at Curve. I don't necessarily, I'm not affiliated with them, I don't suggest use them, but just to kind of work out where we're trying to do this. So we've now decided the journey, all in real time, that is going to do one of a couple of things. Now, if you are looking for, let's say, least cost acquiring, you want to get the best rate for that card, your merchant service charge, and this can be across the whole country or whatever it is you're trying to achieve. We can then decide to send the payment down to the acquirer that's going to give you the best rate at that moment in time. That might not be your driver. It might be that you're working in an environment where you're seeing high decline rates because the acquirer you're using, the risk profile that you have boarded with maybe is falling outside. Their appetite for dealing with you maybe isn't quite there. And we saw this in COVID with something as familiar as travel and tourism. So WorldPay, as an example, decided to pull back. When we started to see COVID come in and people like EasyJet and Virgin, people trying to charge back their flights, we then started to see the acquirers binning off a lot of these real high street household names, right? Big problem. If they were using an orchestrator and they had multiple acquirers behind the scenes, losing a couple or consolidating that book of risk would have made it a lot easier for those acquirers to turn around and say, we're going to continue working with you, okay? And then you've got open banking. Now, on the mainland, open banking is becoming very commonplace. What it basically is using your bank account in order to facilitate a transaction, a bit like BACS, but it's biometric. So what will happen is you click on the button, your banking app will fire up. You then select the account within that app that you want. So your Halifax, for example, you'll select which account, biometrically authenticate it, and that money then flies out. Okay. Now, the reason it's good to add this to this is because when you're thinking of alternative payment methods and you're giving the cardholder a range of options, Apple, Google, PayPal, your card, stored card, or using your open banking, at the end of the day, as the merchant, you just want the money, you just want that payment to go through, you want it to be as frictionless as possible. Now, there are benefits for using open banking. There's things like chargeback and PCI compliance, which you don't have to worry about. But by and large, making sure that you are enabled for it is the principal driver. And as an as a orchestrator, making sure that we deliver as many payment methods as possible is kind of our core business. Okay. Now, when I've talked a little bit about having multiple acquirers. So we've tried to build as many as possible, and sometimes these are super easy because you'll talk to them and they'll say, here's our API, go forth and integrate. Others, slightly different because they're as old as the hills. God was a boy when they came around, and unfortunately the code base that they're using isn't really up to scratch. And that's absolutely fine because a lot of the big companies are the ones that the other big organizations want to work with. It's this classic, no one gets fired for hiring BT, even though they're going to be an absolute pain in the backside. So if you want to work with the Barclaycards and the WorldPays, but you want them to compete with each other, then using someone like Encoded, where we've done a lot of that heavy lifting for you, we give you our API, which is very modern, super easy, RESTful, and you are then given immediate access to all of these acquirers behind the scenes. Okay. Again, I won't go into it because I appreciate that I've only got so much time. So let's have a look at some of the use cases. Now, I mentioned before about there being a risk appetite. Now, if you've ever got a merchant account, you'll know that one of the things you need to identify is your MCC, or Merchant Category Code. It's a bit like a SIC code for when you're starting a business. That gives the acquirer a risk profile for the type of transactions that they're going to process on your behalf. Okay, so if you think straight away you've got gambling and adult and things like that, that's obviously on the grayer side of the market. But if you're just selling fruit and veg, or you've got something that is like, I can't think now, but less risky, then the MCC is meaning that you're low risk, low value, super easy, and it's based on the chargeback. So if you're doing 1 million transactions, but they're only £1 in value, the risk to the acquirer of a chargeback is £1. If you're doing £1 million transaction, but you're doing one a year, the risk of chargeback is £1 million. And so your merchant service charge is going to be that much higher. So by boarding multiple acquirers, in this case I've given Adyen and Barclaycard as an example, if, for example, and in real time, one does not want to take the risk, or it gives you a decline code, you don't respond with a decline code. You respond by sending that same transaction down to the next acquirer in the list. Okay? Least cost acquiring. Now, this has become a really big thing. Let's say that you're running a business, and you could go through to Stripe as a good example. You will usually have a conversation at the beginning of that relationship, and they will ask you various questions, and they will then say, that's fine, you can have a merchant account, and we're going to charge you 1.2% and 20 pence. And there's no negotiation until you come back around maybe in 3 years' time, or when that conversation comes back again or the contract expires. By using orchestration, you go and get multiple accounts, and then mid-contract, you can then have that conversation with your account manager and say, I am going to send all of my debit cards down to you. What are you going to give me, say, for the next 6 months? And this can be fueled on something like it's Black Friday, or it's Christmas, or it's Mother's Day, or for whatever reason these scenarios are going to happen. But it means that that conversation can happen mid-contract, and they can change your merchant service fee, and you can then in real time send all of those transactions down. It puts you in control. Okay, and if you're running a business where you are able to foresee change, and we do a thing called Encoded Insights, then you can have those conversations. And a lot of the time, just by shaving a few basis points off of your merchant service fee, you can pay for our services, which means we become a zero-cost supplier. Okay? I'm completely unaware of what time I'm doing. I'm just chatting now. But something else that I just want to talk about, Encoded Insights. If we look back over the last few years, we're all aware of COVID. We saw COVID, we saw the cost of living crisis, and then we saw the Omicron variant pop up. And what we were able to do is go back to our customers and say, we are going to be seeing these things coming down. We are predicting that we're going to see a shift from credit cards to debit cards. Now, it's counterintuitive because you think that if somebody's livelihood is put at risk, the first thing they're going to do is start putting money onto their credit card. But that's not what the evidence is showing. That's not what the data is telling us. And so we can now project forward. So if for example, China go into Taiwan, Putin tries it on again. There's a few things that are going to happen which will send ramifications through the markets, supply chains, and so on and so forth. The first thing we're going to do is recommend that our customers start to talk to their account managers about a shift between credit and debit. And then if the account managers are quick enough, the majority of the transactions can then be sent down to, say, supplier A, supplier B, supplier C, and you can then save on that. And making sure that you're ahead of that game can save business so much money, not to mention risk. Okay, so that's quick, least cost acquiring. There's other things I won't spend too much time because I appreciate I'm probably over. But again, I talked a bit about the currency. If your business has multiple product lines, again, one of the things that you'll usually do is set a merchant category code that fits the business and not the product. So where we have seen this working in the past is that, let's say that the business has multiple lines. So a good example might be a white goods business that also does repairs. Every single month, a couple of pounds comes out to cover the risk of the white goods going wrong. Say a hot point are great at this, £3 a month, £3 a month, £3 a month. And then the thing goes up the spout and the very thing that's broken is the thing that's not covered. So you get £100 come on the card. Now what we were seeing is that there was a 10% decline rate for those uplift transactions. And the reason they were getting declined is because the issuers were seeing that it was not keeping track with the pattern that was being used on that merchant account. So what we did is we went back and got multiple merchant accounts set up with different merchant category codes so that it gave the issuers, the card issuers, peace of mind that the payments that were coming through fit with what was expected. Okay? And it's, again, all of this is real time. There's various other things, alternative payment methods. I won't go into too much because most of you are probably familiar with them already. Fraud. Now, if we are then connecting to all of these different acquirers, all these different gateways and the open banking, we can then start to cherry pick the best bits in order to make sure that the transaction is legitimate. Okay? If you're in a contact center and you're collecting card information, that's a MOTO transaction or a mail order, telephone order, card holder not present transaction. It's probably the riskiest one there is. And it's not backed by any 3DS, so there's no two-factor authentication. So what we're starting to see is that if you can tell the issuers that we have gone through additional levels of validation, they can then use a thing called liability shift, which stops the chargeback from happening. Okay, now we're getting into the bit deep here, but what we can effectively do is use the open banking API at the point of payment to then say biometrically authenticate me. That banking app will then tell us it's an affordability score, that the address that we are going to be collecting from matches the card, that the bank account is linked to this card. We get all of this information so that when we then send that down to the issuer, we can say that we have gone above and beyond. We have done a two-factor authentication, and we can then start to see this liability shift. Okay, liability being that you then have to prove, if you want to charge it back, you have to prove that it wasn't you that did it. If you don't have that, you can just ring up your card supplier and say, I didn't make that transaction, and then it's up to the merchant to prove that you did. Okay, there's a liability shift. So it's either the merchant's responsibility or it's the cardholder's responsibility. Okay, I know. Thank you very much indeed. Any questions?
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, well, I mean, not a day ago, I was talking separately, but I guess the pariah markets, in payments, porn, gambling, crypto, that card issuers and payment processors hate. How does orchestration help those merchants to facilitate payments legitimately?
So they're not frowned upon in every jurisdiction, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges. So if you look at Norway, for example, you're not allowed to gamble. Okay, so what we're seeing is a lot of acquirers setting themselves up as crypto exchanges, having the merchant account coded as crypto, but having those funds then funneled back as gambling in the form of a cryptocurrency.
So that's a modern version of what used to happen in the States, where people bought like telephone voucher cards,
Yes.
and basically spent them on gambling sites.
Yeah, and we're seeing, and actually, if you move that forward, what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa is that we're using minutes, so sell minutes as a currency in its own right. So what you will, you'll top your phone up with 1,000 minutes, and you can then transfer those minutes to another account, and now the minutes, the airtime becomes the currency. So having to code the merchant account so that it is the risk profile meets the service that's actually being paid for is a constant. The goalposts are constantly moving.
So does that mean that you've got an obfuscation layer effectively built in?
Within reason, we have to be really careful because we're working globally. There's lots of different things. So we don't shoulder we give the information for the merchant and the acquirer to make those decisions. We're not sat there as God in that respect. So we are making sure that the transaction can go through. I suppose you could say that we're purveyors in authorization codes. All we're interested in really is A, it's a legitimate payment. In other words, it's not somebody stealing. And B, is there an authorization code at the end of it? What happens beneath that? Really, we kind of say to the acquirers, do your due diligence, do your KYC, your AML, all that sort of stuff. And if you deem it legitimate, we'll honour it. So it's not we're passing the buck, if I say slightly. Where I was trying to say at the very beginning, you might recall me saying what we can do for Jersey and where a lot of people want Stripe, and I think I missed that because I was so excited about looking at Ed telling me to sit down. It suddenly means that you can get all of the functionality that Stripe offer you. So all of the shopping carts, all of the e-com, all of the alternative payment methods. But instead of being at the behest of Stripe's merchant service charges, you can now go and get those from wherever you want. And we have a thing called reverse solicitation. So it means that it is effectively a document that you can take to some of these acquirers and say, you can work in Jersey because I've approached you. And that's a whole presentation in its own right. Okay.